All right, good afternoon, everyone. Everyone being Mr. Dave Conklin, glad to see you on. I'm sure we'll get a few more people trickling in just a couple minutes here, but for timekeeping's sake, we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us for our weekly Urban Water Innovation Systems webinar. We're going to switch gears a little bit with a presentation from the Thrust D team at Oregon State University today. Dr. Mary Santelmann will be discussing her team's multi-scale approach to design and evaluation of innovation in urban water systems to promote best practices. Research activities in Thrust D focus on integration of data, models, and products from all other themes and projects to facilitate enhanced decision-making. This synthesizes results from assessments under projects in Thrust A, technological solutions under Thrust B, and socioeconomic and management solutions under Thrust C to identify viable options that provide maximum benefits at the system levels. The synthesis will help our team develop the sustainability indicators that comprise the UWIN Urban Water Sustainability Blueprint. Our webinar schedule and details are posted on the UWIN calendar, which can be accessed from the main menu of our website. We'll continue to record each webinar and post to our YouTube channel, and as always, a link to the video will be distributed as soon as it's available. All participants have entered muted, so please enter your questions into the chat queue, and we will address them at the end of Mary's presentation. So please be sure to tune in next week. We're going to actually switch back to Thrust C with a presentation from Dr. Jessica Bolson at Florida International University. Dr. Bolson will be discussing homeowner adoption of new technologies. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our presenter for today, Mary Santelmann. Dr. Santelmann is the director of the Water Resources Graduate Program and an assistant professor in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. She has led and collaborated on 4 large interdisciplinary projects, including the UWIN project. Her research includes study of ecosystem response to land use and management using alternative future scenarios, and the ecology and biochemistry of wetlands and riparian systems. So we are going to turn the controls over to Mary in Oregon. So bear with us for just a second while we get that switched.
Thank you, Sarah.
So I can see your PowerPoint in outline mode.
Okay.
All right, looks good. Take it away, Mary.
All right, thank you. And a quick correction, I'm actually an associate professor at Oregon State University as well as director for the Water Resources grad program. Thanks for joining me here today to talk about the D1-1 project and multi-scale modeling of alternative futures for urban water systems. First of all, I want to give credit to the Oregon project team. As with everyone's project, this is a team effort, and so Oregon State University has several participants, University of Oregon, my colleague Dave Hulse and his lab, freshwater simulations that work up in Portland, and also our stakeholder advisor committee that assist us with development of alternative future scenarios. So in modeling sustainable water management indicators to compare alternative water management scenarios in the present and future, we have developed a process. And that process uses a transdisciplinary approach to engage our expert water managers of the region, people from the Oregon Water Resources Department, Portland Bureau of Environmental Services, water providers and wastewater managers in the region, both in the Portland area and Eugene Springfield. And with their expertise and our modeling approaches, we developed 3 alternative future scenarios for urban water systems from 2010 to 2060. And concurrently, at the same time, we're also developing the modeling capability to evaluate those alternative future scenarios with the model that we call UWIN Envision for Oregon UWIN Envision, with models that may be more familiar to people such as SWIM and SWOT that are appropriate to different scales of analysis. And then again, at the same time, we are multitasking to identify appropriate indicators and the appropriate scale at which to model and evaluate those indicators. We're in the process of actually running simulations, and as we do that, what we report and how we evaluate those scenarios has forced us to think about scale in very specific ways, and about what I would call fit-for-purpose modeling, to take a phrase that MASDAQ uses as fit-for-purpose water and also apply that to modeling approaches. We are trying to develop the capacity to use our Oregon study sites as a UWIN testbed, and so the next steps for our project are going to be to run the simulations using our models to compare the futures and synthesize the information to improve our understanding of urban water systems. So that's kind of the direction and overview of what we're doing in Project D1-1. And so now to flesh that out a little further. Well, I had the luxury of coming out of this project in the second year as a co-PI with Dr. Roy Haggerty. So I have the perspective both of an outsider and an insider, knowing what it is that we're doing, and also I spent some time just asking, well, why are we doing this? And also delving into literature, looking at what other people are doing and say, why are they doing it? And one of the most articulate expressions of why we should be doing this type of synthesis is I encountered in a chapter in a forthcoming book, Assessing Water Megatrends. And Harry and Varavamurthy say, harvesting experience is needed to build robust evidence base for the implementation of what has already worked in new locations, so that resources can be directed towards appropriate adaptation to local contexts rather than wholesale reinvention. I thought, yes, that's a good reason to do this kind of work and to spend time on the synthesis of what each of the separate projects are doing to put together a story that says what works, what context does it work best in, and how can these approaches for urban water sustainability be made to be transferable. So I'm going to step back a little bit and define the terminology that I use when I talk about things like multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary. So when I use the term multidisciplinary, I mean research and education that draws from multiple disciplines but doesn't seek to integrate or synthesize among them. So you have many projects that all of us have been on have been more of a handoff than they have been an integrative synthesis that actually transforms the way we do our research. That type of work, transformative process, is what I think of as interdisciplinary research. So in my mind, interdisciplinary research integrates different disciplinary perspectives in framing the research and in the synthesis of the results. The process of being interdisciplinary then transforms the research. It changes the way questions are asked and answered, and the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I use the image of bouillabaisse, which is greater than the sum of its parts, as an illustration of that kind of process. And then transdisciplinary, like interdisciplinary research, is integrative and synthetic. It takes those different disciplinary perspectives, not only uses them to transform the research, but also includes stakeholders and end users of the research in project development and in transforming the research questions, how they are asked, how they are answered. So when I talk about a transdisciplinary project, I am specifically talking about a project that engages the stakeholders and uses their expert knowledge and their place-based knowledge and their local knowledge to inform the research, and beginning the research with the end user in mind. So on our project, we have a very broad range of participants. I can show some of them here. This is not all of them, but what I would note is that the innovative approaches of the practitioners in our region have really humbled us. As we met with the people who are actually managing the water and started talking to them about our ideas and our plans to run models, we realized that these are already innovators. These are the people who are out in front. And so their knowledge has informed and inspired our future scenarios and led us to include elements like conservation of large riparian areas and floodplain restorations to offset development, not just small green infrastructure features in neighborhood urban developments, but really thinking at a watershed scale as we plan for the future. So Portland, Oregon, probably well known to most of you. They've invested a lot in green infrastructure. They have award-winning projects, and the transdisciplinary approach, therefore, makes a lot of sense here, so that we can inform practice by evaluating the potential future impact, and specifically impacts that our stakeholders are interested in, and the scenarios that we run are informed by practitioners, both to address things that they're interested in having us explore, and they've actually provided us with knowledge, with databases, with LiDAR coverages. So it's a beneficial environment, and we've really received a lot back already, even kind of mid-project from our stakeholders. So we begin by working with them to imagine the future. And I also want to also underscore the fact that this is a work in progress. So some of the things that I'm going to show you here today are definitely going to change the next time you see them in Fort Collins at our next meeting. But this is so you're going to journey along with us as we develop and imagine the future in Oregon. So we engage our expert stakeholders in defining what the attributes are that are going to distinguish the scenarios from one another, and what the indicators are that will help us evaluate how those differences in, say, climate or population growth, or how we manage forest or agriculture or urban areas that are logically consistent within each of the scenarios, how those play out at each of the scales in our modeling approach. So this is a figure from my colleague Dave Hulse, kind of illustrating that stakeholder engagement process as it's used to develop and evaluate scenarios. So you have these mesh grids that going from the past into the future, with the mesh representing specific landscapes over time and land use and management practices that define them, and at each point different choices can be made that move landscapes in different directions, so that a landscape that's in a particular state now moves into a different state, or possibly maintains its current state, as in the dashed gray line. But in any case, choices made at particular points in this timeline influence the direction in which these scenario assumptions propel us into either an unsurprising future, or perhaps a different, unexpected, and surprising future. So our approach, and this is something that we kind of cover perhaps ad nauseum with our stakeholders, but we really want to make sure that they understand that we can't model everything, and we can't ask and answer every question that's of interest. And so we try to limit the expectations and over-deliver on our promises by reminding our stakeholders that where we work is in this sweet spot between the available data, the stakeholder interests, and of course our interests. In a way, we are also stakeholders in this research. So when I say interests, it's the interests of the research team as well, and then the modeling capability that we have. And so there may be things that lie in the realm of their interests or our interests that we simply, and that we could model, but we don't have the available data to investigate those things. Similarly, we might not have the modeling capacity, even though we have available data. We may not have the modeling capacity or the resources on this particular project to answer some of the questions. But of course, we do have connections to other projects, and that may be a way that we can enlarge the sweet spot by generating a test bed here in Oregon for the other projects to test out some of their models and evaluative approaches. So at this point in time, in addition to our present landscape, the Stakeholder Advisory Committee has developed 3 themes for the scenarios. The current course, so continuing current practices and current institutions into the future, a stressed resources future, and then an integrated water future. And I'll flesh those out a little bit as we go on. So in the current course, some of our assumptions are that population growth is going to be continuing along the current published estimates. So we would expect to see about 4.2 million people in Oregon in the Willamette River Basin in 2060. a middle of the range climate projection, so that you'd expect to see a increase of about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit in the mean annual temperature by 2060. Irrigation from agriculture at the current use rates, wildfire suppression at historic rates, and reservoir operations and environmental flow requirements are maintained in their current status. If you move down a scale into urbanizing watersheds, the assumptions guiding this current course at the watershed scale are that the current MS4 regulations and parameters in areas that are outside the combined sewer system are going to continue to define development. Cooperative agreements that exist and are currently in place will continue, but are not going to be extended, and that there will be continued water demand patterns similar to the past for large industrial and institutional users. And then finally, in neighborhoods, for areas that are on combined sewer systems, the CSO system is designed for 10-year storms, and they're striving to meet regulatory goals of an average of 4 or fewer CSO events per winter, and only 1 every 3 summers, according to their existing permits. They will meet existing city goals of 600 future green infrastructure acres, and not very much stormwater reclamation, not a lot of water reuse. I'll go through the next ones a little faster, but these are the things that people are imagining. Again, 3 different spatial extents and scales of analysis, and then these are the attributes of those futures that people in the stakeholder committee think are important. Under the stressed resources, you see that there's population growth almost doubled in urban areas, so 5.78 million instead of 4.2 in 2060. High-end climate change projections, instead of 3.6, now 6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer mean annual temperature in 2060. Now you have greater water demands. Municipal and irrigation contracts put in place for Willamette project for the water behind the dams, the 13 Bureau of Reclamation dams. We have an increase in forest wildfires in response to the increased temperatures, increase in fire suppression, and also in harvest. We would anticipate that current reservoir operations and environmental flow requirements are maintained in the future, and so on. So another feature at the urbanizing watershed scale, continued reliance on gray infrastructure and development in protected areas. And one of the key elements that our stakeholders wanted us to consider in this future is that drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater facilities, rather than having investment prior to failure, they are basically run to fail and repaired only at the time of failure. And so there are costs that are associated with that in terms of the events that happen with water management and the failure of the infrastructure over time. Some of those are represented here in the neighborhood. You get CSO events that are beyond what the current permit limits, and green infrastructure facilities aren't maintained and are not functioning as well, and therefore there no new green infrastructure is implemented. And the underground injection control system, these large wells about 30 feet deep that are used to capture stormwater and directly move it into the subsurface, they're also run to fail and then abandoned, and no implementation of aquifer recharge. And then finally, in the integrated water management future, they wanted us to use the same pressures of population and climate, but imagine instead that there is a response and sort of a preemptive development of infrastructure that anticipates these changes and mitigates and adapts to them before there's infrastructure failure. So new municipal and irrigation contracts for that Willamette project water. The Willamette River Basin assumptions are very similar to the stressed resources, but at the urbanizing watershed scale, you have ecosystem services provided by green infrastructure. Those are recognized and monetized. As a result, you see more conservation and restoration. You see extensive institutional agreements, cooperative agreements between urban and non-urban partners, maybe even NGOs and service providers, water sharing MOUs. So there is not only physical infrastructure, there's also institutional infrastructure that goes along with it. And of aquifer storage and recharge opportunities are used, and facilities for treating drinking, wastewater, and stormwater are repaired on schedule or in anticipation of increased use. And then you can see the city neighborhoods again, designed for 25-year storms, and they meet existing goals, and they maintain the infrastructure and the green infrastructure that's been put in place. So once we have these representations, these concepts, then the next step is to have them be represented in our modeling approaches and field test and evaluate those futures. So a little background here. Again, we spent some time before going out and reinventing the wheel, looking into ways that people in other places and in other projects have used this approach to identifying and assessing sustainability for urban water systems with specific indicators. So on your screen now is an example of a project done in Europe in which a system was developed to evaluate cities on a global scale. And so what you see in the large set of indicators, first of all, is that there are many indicators. For example, access to drinking water at about 3 o'clock, or access to sanitation, drinking water quality. Those are elements that might differ from one city to another on a global scale. But within the U.S., we would probably not see large-scale differences in access to drinking water, for example. So modifying this type of indicator, and in addition, I should also say that many of the indicators, not all, but many of the indicators in this diagram were on a scale of 1 to 5 and expert judgment. So not all were quantified with simulations or with models. Some of them were, the indicator was allocated on expert judgment, and so we of course want to be able to do more quantification of our indicators through our modeling. And for all the people on the UWIN indicator team, here's some food for thought. You know, we've been wallowing around with these indicators and trying to figure out, you know, what's the most appropriate indicator, what represents our stakeholder needs, what represents our interests, what can be something that is a useful. And so some of the criteria that we've started to develop and food for thought for the indicator team. Well, first of all, the process should be informed by other work, but also allow us to explore and to innovate. We want to use indicators that are of interest to our stakeholders. You know, we don't want to model and evaluate things just because we can. We want also to model things that will be of interest to the end users of this information that can actually help guide and inform the implementation of low-impact development and green infrastructure and innovation in water management of the future. We want to see consistency across UWIN regions, but you want to temper consistency also with the understanding that the regions are different, and so the same indicators that are useful in Oregon, for example, might not be as useful in Florida or Arizona. I'm thinking here maybe for us, snow water equivalent storage in the snowpack is a really important predictor of one of the pressures and trends of water supply. But that's probably not a big deal in Florida, right? At least not at this point in time. The indicators that we choose should also allow us to compare these cities or regions within cities, not only in space, but also in time. And not only within one city, but also across regions and across alternative futures. So maintaining the ability to have an indicator that allows you to compare, say, Portland with Phoenix, but also one that allows you to compare Portland in 2010 with Portland in 2060. And that will constrain how you model or how you evaluate the alternative future scenarios. One constraint we continually run up again, we get great ideas and ambitious thoughts, but we also have to remind ourselves, not within project resources. We would love to do this, but right now we open the door to future research questions. So feasibility is an important thought. And then finally, we're looking forward to what interests other UWIN collaborators when they see the future scenarios that we're developing and the data that we have and the projections for the future. How might that stimulate their ideas and get people excited about working in Oregon and in Portland in particular as a test bed? So we kind of have grouped indicators like Koop and Van Leeuwen into two types. There are sort of basin scale pressures and trends, so available water quantity, water quality, and ecosystem properties such as biodiversity, but that can be many more things than just biodiversity. And then other indicators that really reflect the performance of the urban water system. Metrics of stormwater and stormwater management, drinking water, wastewater, and also impacts on natural streams or water bodies. So this is the representation of our UWIN Envision model as it exists in July of 2017. And so now when you look on the left and look at the scenario inputs, so the drivers of the different alternative futures, you see climate change, population growth, and then different policy, management, and technology choices. And so those specifications then are put into and initiate the autonomous processes, the changes in landscape, changes in vegetation, in population growth over time. And as the model steps through time, data are stored and then retrieved. And the spatial unit that is the kind of the atom, if you will, of our model are the individual decision units, or these polygons called IDUs. And so you see on the spatial and temporal database in the bottom, all the little units there, those little polygons are individual decision units that a particular landowner or decision maker is controlling what happens on that parcel. So then the spatial and temporal data are used in basin scale modeling, processes such as urban expansion, forest disturbance, and then change over time in the species composition, so succession in the forest, particularly at higher elevations after there are fires and then recolonization of different species. Crop and irrigation decisions, runoff and stream flow. We have models for reservoir operations and models that incorporate water rights, particularly seniority and whose rights can be fulfilled and whose rights can't be fulfilled with a given stream flow in the Willamette River. With our watershed scale modeling, we look at water imports and exports into these smaller watersheds, these sub-watersheds. We look at ecosystem services provided, things like whether habitat for a particular species group or set of species is preserved or expanded or lost. We have a project ongoing with some of our colleagues at other 6 cities where we looked at how greenness and temperature are related, and so the amenities and temperature refugia in cities could be something that we could model at a watershed scale. Buffers and the effect of area-based solutions for green infrastructure. So there we're thinking floodplain restorations, large bioswales, riparian buffers, and so on. And then at the neighborhood scale, using models such as SWIM, looking at water supply and conservation, green infrastructure solutions, gray water reuse, and how those would impact the water balance and the indicators that we use to compare cities across the country and now and into the future for the water system performance. So the pressure and trend indicators are largely calculated at the basin scale and are quantity and quality and some sort of whole ecosystem indicators. And then the water system performance indicators, pretty much of necessity, are being calculated at the watershed scale and the neighborhood scale within watersheds. So here are the Willamette River Basin pressures and trends, input daily climate data and the attributes of those IDUs, so elevation, land cover, soil types, and so on. And then the output is reported over the whole basin or can be also reported for sub-watersheds within the basin. And then for the 3 different scenarios, we generate indicators at the basin scale of water quantity, quality, and so on. And at this point, I also want to emphasize that we're also striving for logical consistency across scales, so that things that are modeled at this more coarse spatial extent and temporal extent, we're trying to also make what the outputs of the UWIN Envision model will tell us about a particular location logically consistent with what the watershed and the neighborhood scale models will tell us for the same place. So there are subbasins of the Willamette River Basin, and we can actually also report the data that's collected on pressures and trend in these subbasins and look for geographic differences and better understand the system over time. Our watershed scale study areas in the Portland, Oregon region are a developed watershed in West Johnson Creek, and then a developing watershed, Chicken Creek, with an area that is currently developed in the northeastern quadrant, and then urban reserves, areas that are designated as next in line for development surrounding the already developed areas that are now in agriculture or forest land. So in our focal watersheds then, we're looking at the urban water system performance with different ranges of development densities and different looks to the urbanizing neighborhoods, different amounts of green infrastructure, different types of green infrastructure. At the whole watershed scale compared to the neighborhood scale, we have a slightly more coarse resolution, and the water systems are virtual water systems. They are not the representations of the existing drinking water system or the existing sewer system. They're at a more coarse resolution than that, but they will allow us to evaluate the system performance. And then we are hoping to run continuous simulations for representative periods for these focal watersheds. We also will be able to, as we do this, we'll be able then to compare the outputs of this logically consistent UWIN Envision model for that same spatial extent, and that model has already had what we call SWIM Lite, the SWIM 5 model from the EPA, incorporated and plugged into UWIN Envision so that we can model say the Chicken Creek watershed or Johnson Creek with UWIN Envision and SWIM Lite, and then we can also model that same area with other models that are more familiar to people, such as SWAT, and then compare we call it our bake-off, our model bake-off, and get an opportunity to learn from different modeling approaches how these landscapes perform and how different evaluative models identify different things. Again, input data, climate data, spatial attributes, and the output performance metrics. And at this scale now, we're working very hard with our watershed stakeholders. We're actually going out with them into the watersheds and say, okay, what would you do here? What are the indicators that make sense to evaluate here, so that they can help us sort through the multitude, really, of potential indicators to get ones that really represent what they're interested in knowing about the future, things that will help them both in management and communication with their stakeholders, their clients and the people that they work with. Here's one of our neighborhood scale study areas in Portland. This is West Johnson Creek. So this is the fairly highly developed area. It's an area that has been prone to flooding for a long time. It's an area where these underground injection control wells have been placed. Not so much, not as many in West Johnson Creek as in the eastern part, but some are there. But they have done extensive floodplain restoration, in implementation of bioswales and green infrastructure. So the landscape is one that's already developed, but can be further kind of retrofit to incorporate some of the goals, or also we can run the alternative future scenarios where these resources aren't maintained and the infrastructure kind of degrades over time. In the neighborhood scale study area in the developing region, this is that Sherwood Urban Reserve, and now you can kind of see in the northeast corner where my cursor, this is the city of Sherwood. This is an already developed area, and then these tan beige polygons here are the urban reserves around that already developed area. These are sort of the next in line for development, and plans are are underway for development in those areas. The red boundary here is the Chicken Creek watershed. Chicken Creek is this one, and then Cedar Creek feeds into Chicken Creek. So those are the larger watershed, and then this specifically this urban reserve, which is scheduled for development, and we're actually working at planning at the site scale, and again working with our stakeholders to explore questions about how to minimize the impact of that development. So at the neighborhood scale, then, this is the part of West Johnson Creek and the input file for the SWIM model. At that very kind of fine spatial extent and fine resolution with households, nodes, and lots of pipes there, we can use models like SWIM to simulate performance of the urban water system for these neighborhoods within the watersheds and the response to different management practices. We can actually, this might, again, we can model this for that region within the UWIN Envision model with SWIM Lite attached, but we can also model it with SWIM 5 outside of that model and compare. For the Sherwood Urban Reserve neighborhood, this is from the Sherwood plan. Sorry for the quality of the reproduction, but they don't have a better example in their current plan, and we're not ready to unveil our plan quite yet. But for this area, then, we're also looking at the present and 3 future scenarios. And actually, it's interesting because this is somewhat controversial. As we're exploring our scientific research, it's actually becoming somewhat of a political action to imagine and ask certain questions. So our what-if questions actually are somewhat loaded with political and potentially economic meaning for both the stakeholders and the residents of this region. So that's another thing that we have to take into account in our work and try to communicate with our stakeholders as we do this. So now I'm going to move from kind of our multi-scale approach to looking at the indicators that we use for evaluation and our approach. And this is just an initial approach. This is one way. This is not what we're promoting, but it's just like, what if we did it this way? So again, identify indicators, the appropriate scale, look at pressures and trends at the broadest spatial extent, and then at performance indicators at smaller spatial extents. Again, this emerges from the work by Koop and Van Leeuwen, but we're taking it to a different level and doing a much more quantitative type of comparison. But the way that they calculated indicators seems to be somewhat useful. That you can make the value of your indicator, if you're trying to get everything on the same scale so that everything goes from 0 to 10, you can use the decadal value minus the minimum for all decades as your numerator, and then in the denominator the maximum minus the minimum value for all decades. You multiply that by 10, and then you can compare the value of your indicator then across decades. So this is a comparison in time. Again, then, as we've been working with these indicators, we've come up with, all these things that we need to consider. So you need comparators. You're scaling them. You can have maybe the max and the maximum or minimum of a decadal average for scenarios. You can looking at comparisons over time, or you can look at decadal averages by subbasin comparisons in space. You want to think about making sure that you have your indicators so that they all run in the same direction, so that 10 is more sustainable and 0 is less sustainable. So water demand, when you're decreasing water demand, you're decreasing demand, but that might be a good thing. That might be more sustainable. So decreasing water demand actually gets a 10, so that sometimes it's a little bit counterintuitive. And then, of course, as we expand these to other regions, the indicators we'll have to think about, how would we scale? Do we scale within region differently than across regions? And those are questions for project partners. One thing, the method that we just showed you, that tends to intensify differences among the entities. So it forces something to be 0, and it forces something to be the lowest and something to be the highest. So if you actually are comparing a number of things that are the same, it's still going to have, one of them is going to be a 10 and one of them is going to be a 1. You cannot get away from that with that particular method. But if you want to, separate out your scenarios, it's a good way if you want to see and force some separation. So some examples with our Willamette River Basin basin scale model. We've already started running some preliminary simulations with the UWIN Envision model, and we chose for water quantity to take 3 water supply indicators and 3 water demand indicators and look at how those will vary in across the basin and in time. So these are the pilot indicators that we chose to look at, and here's what they look like from the simulations. The one on the left, the blue, is current course, and the solid lines are the outcomes for the first decade, and the dashed lines are outcomes for the last decade from this preliminary run. And what you see, so the area within the polygon is related to sort of this, kind of corresponds to the degree of sustainability that you see. In contrast, the stressed resources, the first decade is this solid orange line. The stressed resources last decade is this tiny little polygon here. So only per capita demand has gone in a positive direction. That's probably per capita demand is down, which means it's in a positive direction, because everything else is so desperate, right? Reservoir storage is down, snow storage is down, and so on. You can also look at this change over time by decade. So looking at snow storage, April 1, snow water equivalent in millimeters in 2010 for the whole basin, 2020, and by 2050 you're down to here. And then basin-wide, if you look at the current course as compared to the stressed resources, which is the one on the left here, and also the orange on the right here, you can see that the snow storage is looking pretty dismal under the stressed resources, which is the high climate. That's a HADGEM 2 model, whereas the current course, which uses a MIROC alternative climate model, is in better shape, a little more snow. You can look at this not only at the whole basin scale, but at the sub-basins, and you can see these on the crest of where the watershed is on the crest of the Cascades. Those same watersheds, Clackamas, North Santiam, McKenzie, and so on, they have the highest precipitation, the highest potential runoff. So they're getting more snow, they get more precipitation, also have the highest runoff. So now we have this ability to compare across basins over time. This is just a quick table to show, yep, you're forcing your best basin to be a 10 and the other ones down to be 0. So this method enhances differences, but it also forces those differences. So there may be attributes of that we want to think about, and this may not be the best method to calculate indicators. It's only one of many. Here's again the comparison of a high elevation basin to a low elevation basin across 2 different climate scenarios. And then finally, I just wanted to summarize our next steps. So with the UWIN Envision model and the plugins and the whole range of models that we can apply at both the whole Willamette River Basin scale and a watershed scale, we've got the unique capability, really, to use a multi-scale approach for designing and modeling alternative future scenarios. I again want to highlight and thank our stakeholders, because they've really improved the quality of what we do and helped us really hone in on the critical questions that they are facing in water management, boots on the ground right now. And that although we've been using indicators and we've been calculating them, these are pilot efforts to develop an appropriate set that maybe straw person indicators, and we expect that our regional stakeholders, our UWIN partners, are going to also have something to say, and that these indicators perhaps will change over time, but we want to make sure to kind of be true to our approach, which is that some of these indicators have got to be responsive to the interests and needs of our stakeholders. And we hope that you get excited as as we are about this multiscale approach and the availability of the data, and that that some of the other UN partners will be interested in using this region as a test bed. So with that, I'll take questions.
Yeah, this is Neil. I've got a question, but I don't know if I have audio here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Neil. Hi.
Hello. Yeah, I apologize. I was listening to your whole webinar, and I just got to the video a few minutes ago, so I have a good idea of what you were talking about, but I didn't see every slide. But I've got three questions. Am I the only one that's on here together with Sarah, or do you have a bunch of other people, or how many on here?
There's other people. You can't see everybody. There's about 7 other people on besides us.
Oh, excellent. Well, I don't need to dominate the questions, but my first question is the UWIN Vision model. I've heard you talk about how you can connect it to SWIM and SWIM 5 and things like that. What's the structure of this UWIN Vision model? Is it like some kind of a meta-scale control over a lot of other models, or what's the nature of that model?
It's an agent-based model, and it operates kind of through the landscape itself. So it's using each individual decision unit, each IDU as a polygon in the spatial database, and those polygons have attributes that can change over time. So something that's currently in irrigated agriculture can be pulled out of irrigated agriculture, for example, and either developed or used for a different crop if the water right to irrigate it is too junior. So it takes it uses the landscape to integrate the choices that are applied to each parcel, or the autonomous processes like vegetation change over time or population growth, which are allocated on a spatial basis. And then there is the capability to plug in other models. So for example, SWIM Lite is a plugin that runs at a faster time step, like a daily time step right now. Actually, we have it on an hourly time step right now, but we're still developing the climate data to run hourly data for SWIM in the Portland area. So the other models can be plugged in. Of course, that will change runtime, and depending on the model, but that's the structure. It's basically a sort of a landscape-centered, agent-based model with each IDU having attributes with autonomous processes that run in the background, and then plug-in models, or I guess you call them subroutines. And you can tell that I am not the model. I'm not the person coding this model, but those that then perform the processes that generate the output data for each of the different attributes or indicators. Is that kind of the?
Yeah, so it's probably a GIS-based model, is that right?
Yes.
And then did you all program that up from scratch, or did you import some kind of model framework to start with on that?
That's a great question. So this model has been in the making for over a decade. I think I was present at its birth. It started off as a model where we were looking at watershed restoration and where to restore things, how much to do, and who would put these things in on their property, and then it grew into a model that would incorporate the choices that people made, as well as the processes that run in the background, the autonomous processes, but allow landscape change and the decisions, the policies that are applied to the land by actors to change the model over time. So the landscape changes, and those landscape changes can affect what the actors do. So it has the potential to be a coupled human natural system model. So that model then morphed through something called EVO land, and then EVO land became Envision, and then that model was used in the Willamette Water 2100 project as Willamette Envision. So I think probably over 10 years has been, this model has been in development. It's been applied in Puget Sound and quite a bit in the Willamette River Basin. So we are, John Bolte was the person who originally developed that model, but a number of people have worked on adding code, Dave Conklin among them, Michael Guzzi, Kelly Vache. It uses flow HBV as the hydrologic model. There's, like I say, a water rights model was developed and attached to it. So it's really got quite a bit of capability to model different things.
Great. Well, that helps me a lot. Yeah, last thing I would say is I've got a suggestion that popped into my head when I was listening to you talk about the indicators and how they're just pilot indicators and you have to shape them to what the stakeholders need. It makes me think that there's an opportunity to push the project further out, whether it would be something you all would do or something that another project team would do. I don't know, but the project would be to align the different governance spaces of different stakeholders with the indicator groups and create like an institutional stakeholder indicator model that responded to all of the different decisions and planning and different things that are going on in the different regions. And of course it'd take a while to spin out exactly how that could be done, but what you all are doing with indicators could be a big part of it, and that's just a thought I had. I just pass it along.
Thank you.
All right.
I haven't seen any other questions pop in, so I think maybe you floored everybody. Well, as always, I'll send out a link once I get this posted to our YouTube channel. Thanks everyone for tuning in this afternoon. Thank you, Mary, for that wonderful presentation, and Neil for a little discussion there afterwards. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week. Do you have any closing remarks, Mary?
No, just thanks everybody who tuned in now, and to those of you who are going to tune in on when this is up on YouTube, and appreciate. And if there are other suggestions or questions, and particularly comments about indicators, that'll be great. Hopefully we can have I think next week is our first indicator group meeting, so maybe this will give people something to chew on over the weekend.
Absolutely, and maybe I'll include that in the appointment reminder as well. All right.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day. It's good to hear your voice.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.